The next section of this course will focus on the origins of complex civilizations in Mesoamerica. Because this is where I do my research, I will focus a little bit more on Mesoamerica than some of the other societies we've talked about. And as we're going through our discussion of Mesoamerica, pay special attention to the ways in which it's similar and different from other societies we've talked about. So some of the factors in terms of the accumulation of wealth, for monumental constructions, social hierarchy, the importance of religion, and so forth, are going to be similar to ancient societies that we've discussed. But there are also going to be some unique aspects in terms of particularly the relationship between shamanism and rulership, as well as things like the importance of ideology in general, and less emphasis on irrigation agriculture and less emphasis on the domestication of animals. So these are some things to keep your eye on. If we look at Mesoamerica in terms of a broader comparison with other early ancient societies we've discussed, you can see that in this part of the New World, which is really much of Mexico and Central America, complex civilizations emerged at slightly later, but roughly the same time as they did in other parts of the world that we've discussed, like ancient China, for example. So here's another region relatively close to the equator where complex society developed independently. Here on this map, you can see a more detailed view of Mesoamerica. The term Mesoamerica really has both a geographic and a cultural component. Geographically, it typically, for most archaeologists, means most of Mexico and Central America, so much of Mexico, particularly southern Mexico, as well as the Yucatan Peninsula region and parts of Central America, such as, for example, Guatemala and Belize. Some archaeologists also include areas further into West Mexico. And the reason for the disagreement about the exact size and shape of Mesoamerica is that it also has a cultural meaning in terms of practices that sort of define Mesoamerican culture, as we will talk about today. Something else that we should discuss before we go further is the chronology of Mesoamerica. When I talk about Mesoamerican archaeology, I typically refer to a few important time periods: the Paleo-Indian, the Archaic, the Formative, the Classic, and the Post-Classic period. You can see here that these are often divided up into sort of sub-periods. For example, my research focuses primarily on early formative period Mesoamerica. You can see that that dates to 2000 to 1000 before the Common Era. And so we will be discussing, in the first half of this lecture, we'll kind of be focusing on everything up to somewhere in the Classic period, and then we'll discuss Classic and Post-Classic in the second component of this lecture. So as we discussed in a previous lecture, the Americas were one of the last major land masses colonized by modern humans. The dates for the exact arrival of people to the New World vary. We've discussed that as well, with a good estimate being somewhere around 20,000 years ago, perhaps. And we don't know too much about the first occupants of Mesoamerica. We do know a little bit more about the Archaic period occupants of Mesoamerica. So here you can see some photographs from the mid-20th century, some excavations going on at highland cave sites in central Mexico, at Gilinaquiz and Caxcatlan. And these cave sites are important for a couple of reasons. For one thing, they had good preservation of organic materials, which has provided some early evidence of the plants that were being domesticated in Mesoamerica. While ancient Mesoamericans didn't have as many domesticated animals as did the Old World societies of the Near East and Northern Africa and even China, they did domesticate a lot of plants. In fact, when you walk into the grocery store today, look around you, corn, certain types of squash, tomatoes, avocados, many of our favorite foods, we can actually thank ancient Mesoamericans for those things. So the Archaic period in general fits what I've discussed for other parts of the world prior to the development of the first settled farming villages. In the Archaic period in Mesoamerica, we saw relatively small groups of mobile forager farmer peoples moving around the landscape. they weren't lost and just wandering around, but rather they were moving seasonally in order to take care of seasonally available resources and in order to harvest those. They didn't use pottery. They probably used some skins and other perishable materials for storage. And they definitely had tools and stone tools and so forth, but of a small, relatively portable style because they're moving around. That tends to make sense. They had a broad-based subsistence strategy. So we learned earlier in the class that the first migrants to the Americas, in some cases, hunted megafauna like mastodons and mammoths and so forth. Well, by the Archaic period, as megafauna went extinct in most of the world, human populations around the world needed to broaden their subsistence strategies and start exploiting smaller, more diverse, and more readily available foods. And this probably had a role in leading to agriculture. So we see in the Archaic the first beginnings of the move toward agriculture. They weren't agriculturalists yet in the sense that they weren't reliant on domesticated crops, but rather they were starting to domesticate crops and a few animals. So we see the dates here, gourds and squashes domesticated by somewhere around 10,000 years ago. Maize domesticated by somewhere around 9,000 years ago, or 7,000 BCE. Chile and amaranth also relatively early in their domestication, and then beans come later. But these things ultimately sort of form what has been called a triad in the Mesoamerican diet: beans, squashes, and maize or corn. For the most part, especially in the Archaic, these were grown with just rainfall and no formal irrigation. As you can see here in this slide, as people settled down into more permanent villages, they started to use larger and larger ground stone technology to process their corn. So this mano and metate are large stone implements that you wouldn't want to carry around if you were a nomadic horticulturalist. So these tend to be associated with more permanent sedentary villages. Also in this slide, note the amazing physical transformation from teosinte, the wild ancestor of corn, that was first domesticated starting 9,000 years ago, to what we see as modern corn. This is a really amazing change in a species. Corn is so different from its wild ancestor that it was almost invented. It's basically an example of genetic engineering. Corn has some other unusual features. For example, the kernels don't naturally fall off the cob. They need to be planted by people. That is not something that was natural to teosinte. That's something that people have bred into corn. So the adventure of domesticating corn over the last 9,000 years has been a really fundamental aspect to the establishment of Mesoamerican culture, to the extent that some Mesoamerican native communities, such as I believe the Zapotecs of Oaxaca, refer to themselves as people of corn. Mesoamerican agricultural techniques were varied and in some cases quite sophisticated, and there was a lot of variation depending on what part of Mesoamerica you were in. Mesoamerica is a very geographically diverse place, and so in some areas you have lots of water and you actually need to take water away, so you can do raised field farming in swampy areas where essentially you mound up the kind of mucky, rich, fertile mud at the bottom of the swamp into these raised fields that then can be above the level of the water so that crop roots can survive and not rot. That's one technique if you're in an area with too much water. Other areas with not enough water might have a little bit of irrigation, or hillside terracing is a way to adapt. If your community has grown to the size where it's taken over your farmland, you can actually farm the hillsides by terracing them, but terraces need to be carefully maintained. If they're not, if for some reason the stone walls that hold up your terraces were to collapse, it can result in massive landscape degradation and the loss of topsoil. In rich jungle areas, you also see the prevalence of slash and burn agriculture. In a jungle, the topsoil is actually pretty weak and acidic and thin. It's not a very fertile type of soil, and rather the nutrients in a jungle are stored in the canopy. So if an area of land is cut and then the plants that grew there are burned, that actually releases some of the nutrients in the form of nitrogen into the topsoil, which can then be used for farming. And then at some point when perhaps some of that nitrogen has been used up, the piece of land is allowed to go fallow or to grow back naturally again, and then the plants are once again slashed down and burned after a period of going fallow. So following the Mesoamerican Archaic period, this long period where for thousands of years Mesoamericans were starting to domesticate crops before they settled into villages, we finally see the first establishment of Mesoamerican villages at about 2000 before the Common Era, or almost 4,000 years ago. This is really interesting, and this is one major way, I think, in which Mesoamerica differs from what we've seen in the Old World. So, for example, in the Fertile Crescent of the Near East, farming and living permanently in a village more or less came hand in hand. Once people really started to use domesticates, they started to settle into permanent villages. That didn't really happen in Mesoamerica, and people remained mobile, for 5,000 years after they started to domesticate corn. That's a different pattern than we saw in the Old World. But once it was established in Mesoamerica, these permanent villages became urban and had formal social hierarchies within a few centuries. So here we can see in the early formative village that's been reconstructed in this image, several things going on. These early villagers are starting to produce pottery. You can see that in the foreground. You can also see that they're using a mano and metate to process masa, or maize flour, corn flour. You can see that they've hunted a deer in the background. You can see that their homes are in some cases open, with an open wall. You can see that they had these thatch roof wattle and daub houses, or houses with a sort of a woven stick wall and a grass thatched roof. You can see that they're using an atlatl, or a spear hunter or spear thrower, to hunt. You can see a domesticated dog, and then also notice in the foreground a turkey. The ancient Mesoamericans domesticated the turkey. In fact, the turkey is an interesting case. The turkey was domesticated at least twice, once in Mesoamerica and once in what's now the United States. And it was so important to indigenous communities that Benjamin Franklin actually thought that turkey should be our national bird and not the bald eagle. So that's just a little bit of fun trivia there. So I focus my research personally on the beginning of the early formative period, on that transition from the archaic to the early formative. I think this is a fascinating time in world history. I think that the shift from being a mobile horticulturalist to being a permanently settled villager, with the early establishment of ceramic technologies for pottery vessels, for ceramic figurines that you can see on this slide, as well as a shift in diet toward greater reliance on agriculture, and a shift towards social hierarchy, social complexity, in an ascribed sense, with some people being born into higher levels of social status. I think all of those things that get started in this particular time and place in Mesoamerica about 4,000 years ago are basically one example in the world of one of the most fundamental social changes our species has ever experienced. If you think about our ancestors, all the way back, since before we were anatomically modern, we lived for millions of years as mobile, doing most of our food collecting rather than producing, and then suddenly, in a few times and places during the Holocene, this trend shifted toward permanently occupying a place, toward producing much of our food rather than collecting it, and toward reorganizing the way that we interact with each other socially. So I think this, the Mesoamerican early formative period is both intrinsically interesting, it's interesting in its own right, all by itself, but it's also interesting as a fascinating case study of a particular kind of social change in the ancient world. So I'll be talking a little bit more about my research. All these images that you can see here are somehow related to my research, either photographs of artifacts that we collected, or a burial that we exposed, or some illustrations of artifacts that we found during my research in coastal Oaxaca. So the site where I've focused much of my research in the last really 12 years or so is known as La Consentida. And when you're down there, when you're visiting the site, the name of the site, which roughly means like the spoiled brat, is funny because the site is densely overgrown jungle. It's in a national park. You get bitten constantly by mosquitoes. There are rattlesnakes. I mean, it's a tough place to work. At the very least, you'll be sweating a lot just going there. So working there and then realizing that the site has been named the Spoiled Brat it just makes me chuckle. It's actually named after a local community, a modern community. I don't know if there actually was a consentida who lived in that community. But anyway, it's a very fascinating place to work. It can be a tough place to work. So I do the excavation down on the coast of southern Mexico, in coastal Oaxaca. And then when it comes to do the lab analysis, we typically do that in the highlands of Oaxaca, near the capital city, which is a beautiful city. It's a colonial city, beautiful cobbled streets and so forth. And it's a more temperate environment to do that lab work. So here you can see the location of La Consentida relative to other early formative Mesoamerican sites. And you can also see this map is a little bit more inclusive than the last one I showed. It has some West Mexican traditions, such as Capacha and Opeño included here. So this should give you an idea of how La Consentida and my research is sort of situated within Mesoamerica geographically. At the site of La Consentida, during the excavations there, the most recent ones, we were able to explore different kinds of deposits, everything from trash piles that have all kinds of interesting artifacts, to layers of earth and stratigraphy, to, in this case, the floor of an ancient house. Now, as you've seen in the reconstructions, the houses are ephemeral, or they don't leave a very lasting impression on the landscape. They typically have earthen floors. They have walls that are just made out of sticks. They have roofs that are mostly made out of grass. And so after 4,000 years in the coastal jungle, there's not very much left of a house like that, with the exception of perhaps some post holes to hold up the roof, perhaps some burned mud or burned posts if the house were set on fire, either accidentally or to sort of clean it. And then in some cases, the floor itself, the earthen floor, can be kind of a darker, nitrogen-rich stain just because of the organic materials that get trodden into the floor during the site's occupation. So here you can see we've exposed the floor. We've actually scraped away the stain, so you can see kind of a roughly square shape of this floor. It's a small house, about 3 meters by 3 meters, and then there's a circular orientation of other features around it. We also dug further down at one edge and found some post holes, suggesting it held up the roof. Even though the floor stain was square, the orientation of post holes appears to have been roughly round, so it's not completely clear what the shape of this house was, and it's possible that it had something like an open wall. We also did find a domestic outbuilding, or kind of a smaller structure nearby. Other things that we find at La Consentida include human burials. Here you can see a drawing of a human burial. In fact, there's actually 3 different human burials here that kind of overlap one another in something that might be turning into a cemetery. This would be an early example, kind of a proto-cemetery. And the main individual kind of at the center of this drawing, labeled Burial 2 or Entierro 2, has some interesting artifacts with him. This was an adult male, about 45 years old. He was robust. He was a big, muscular guy. He had a ceramic bottle near his head. He had a chert knife near his chest. Right against his sternum, he may have had a crocodile mandible tool. There's some ceramic figurines. There's a mano. And then there's somebody placed a kind of a flat tabular stone over his pelvis. And then subsequently, some other burials, including Burial 3, were sort of laid over the top of this person. So it was a somewhat kind of a disorganized, shared communal burial space. Some of the things that we find for early formative period sites include pottery. They were really, using new pottery technology to produce a wide variety of vessels. You can see here examples of bottles and jars and a hanging collared jar, and then a couple of small ashtray-sized grater bowls, one of which has a pouring spout. The three artifacts on the left in this image were actually found as offerings with child burials. The bottle on the right was also found with a burial, that adult male I just showed you. And then the large jar in the center was found in a midden or a trash pile that was probably used or probably was produced as they prepared for a big feasting event. So the pottery at these sites, especially because it's early pottery, they're just firing it for the first time. They're learning how to make pottery, perhaps a technology introduced from Central America or northern South America, or a little bit of both. So they're new to it. The pottery is not very hard. It breaks easily and it erodes easily. And so putting it back together, as you've seen here in those three examples that look like they have a lot of cracks to them, that is a painstaking, slow effort. I spent weeks gluing these things together. What you can't see is a couple of those vessels are held together not just by glue, but by kind of a skeleton of like toothpicks and popsicle sticks, because they're so easily broken. And my goal there wasn't just to fix it all. There are hundreds of thousands of pieces of pottery. I don't want to just fix it all. It would be impossible. What I wanted to do was see the assemblage. I wanted to look at what the vessel forms were like. What kind of vessels did they have? And when those vessels were reconstructed, I was able to paint a sort of a still life of it with some sample of the vessel variation that they had at the site. And it's actually a really diverse vessel assemblage that you can see in this reconstruction. Other kinds of tools that people had at La Consentida were made out of stone. Some of them were simple chipped obsidian or volcanic glass that you can see in several of those images. And then they also made smaller chert drills that were perhaps used for some kind of crafting practice, such as crafting, maybe working some shell, or perhaps working wood or drilling somehow. That thing in the center may be some kind of a knife blade that was found with an adult human burial that I showed you just a little bit ago. And then some of those chert tools, as well as some of the pottery, were the subject of a more recent study where I worked with a graduate student and his PhD advisor from Toronto, or the Toronto area rather. And what they did was they used a sonicator, which is a tool that uses sound waves to shake tiny particles of plant material out of the surface of artifacts like pottery. So you can get preserved starch grains and phytoliths, which are these small silica deposits that form in the cell walls of plants, or pollen that is sort of impregnated in the walls of these vessels. You can actually get that out and study it under a microscope, and through that we were able to identify the use of wild beans. We were able to identify the use of corn, and this actually gave us a much richer perspective on diet 4,000 years ago in this coastal Oaxacan community than we had previously. In addition to evidence for ancient diet, one of the features that we found at La Consentida appears to have been a ritual deposit. It looks as though the complete skeleton of a Heloderma horridum, which is a close relative of the Gila monster. It's a rare venomous lizard. In fact, it's one of the only lizards on Earth that can inject venom through its jaws like a snake. Someone took a full animal and laid them out in this pit, and we don't believe that was an accident. It wasn't just a lizard that climbed into a hole, because at the lizard's nose was a small, sharp, 8-million-year-old fossilized shark tooth, possibly used for ritual bloodletting, and at its tail was one of Mesoamerica's oldest musical instruments, a small ocarina in the form of a bird that still plays today. And in fact, I've played it and recorded it, and I'm going to post in the weekly module a link to my Sketchfab account where you can see a three-dimensional model of this instrument and actually hear what it really sounds like. Furthermore, there's other evidence, more things we could talk about, but it seems as though the location of the bird imagery, the water imagery, the body of the reptile are significant and related to a statement about the sacred cardinal directions, which is related to ritual and religious beliefs of Native American communities all the way from Canada to South America. Other things that you find at early formative villages include ceramic figurines that depict people Often women, often not wearing a lot of clothing. They seem to have been very interested in gender and age and the human body. Also, this bird head that you can see. In fact, bird head was probably from a musical instrument. It's broken, but the way that the inside of its neck is smoothed and not rough suggests that it had a rounded, hollow resonating chamber and was another musical instrument. The artifacts over on the right, I didn't excavate. I excavated the other two. But the figurines over on the right were actually found in the 70s in the highlands of Oaxaca. And there's a fun story about one of them. You can see it has something tiny between its feet. That figurine was collected and taken to a lab. And decades later, a student was cleaning it carefully with a toothbrush and found that the space between its legs was actually not ceramic, but was just dirt. So they kept cleaning and they kept cleaning and they kept cleaning. And finally, a tiny baby came out. So this figurine is actually, it sort of allows you to recreate the act of birth. So you can see that with these figurines, they're interested in the human life cycle. They're interested in women's roles in procreation and so forth. Really fascinating aspects of social life that we can approach through the study of these ceramic figurines. Now, in terms of the origins of social complexity, we first see chiefdoms, or societies where someone is born into their role of elevated status, someone is born to be a ruler. We first see that in the Soconusco region that you can see in the lower portion of your map, where it says Mazatán, Paso de la Mata, and Ocos and La Victoria. That's a region of coastal Chiapas and Guatemala where we see the first chiefdoms in Mesoamerica. Now, in the Soconusco sites, by roughly 1600 before the Common Era, what had just started as tiny villages began to grow to over 1,000 people. You started to get larger towns with public buildings and low earthen platforms, and a type of early pottery known as the Barra phase that appears to have been used for feasting and serving foods rather than for cooking them. There's not much evidence that it was actually used to cook, and it's really well decorated. Also in the Soconusco region, at the site of Paso de la Mata, there is specific evidence at a house for the emergence of chiefly rulership. This particular house has been reconstructed. You can see from the first initial construction in level 6 up through the last more established, larger architectural construction in level 2. This house started out just like all the other houses in town at the Paso de la Mata town, but it grew more significant and larger than its neighbors over time. And interestingly, this house was closely associated with a ball court. In fact, the earliest known ball court in Mesoamerica. And this is one reason why archaeologists have suggested that the ball game in Mesoamerica was not just a pastime, it wasn't just a sport, it was related to politics, religion, and the establishment of social complexity. Now, after a few centuries of social complexity in the Soconusco, that region kind of died down for a while, and not as much was going on there. But social complexity actually jumped across the Isthmus of Tehuantepec, which is the narrow band of land you see in the center of your map. This is a flattened area. It's the easiest place to traverse Mesoamerica by land. The Sierra Madre mountains kind of flatten out for a spot there. And it appears as though through interaction and possibly even some migration, social complexity basically moved from the Pacific coast over to the Gulf Coast of Mesoamerica with the establishment of Olmec society. So the Olmecs are a really famous early society in Mesoamerica. There's still much we don't know about them. It appears that they were starting to experiment with writing, but we can't read everything they said. They made some really incredible and kind of enigmatic artifacts, such as giant heads, these colossal stone heads the size of a Volkswagen, that appear to show humans, not some kind of deity, not something supernatural, but human portraits of men wearing these helmets. They look kind of like old-fashioned leather American football helmets, and they may be helmets for the ball game or warrior helmets or both. The Olmecs are also known for their particular artistic style, their pottery, and after a few centuries of their fluorescence in the Olmec Gulf Coast region, they actually appear to have been involved in a broader influence across Mesoamerica during the Middle Formative period. So some of the main Olmec sites include this San Lorenzo. This is the earliest major Olmec center, and at San Lorenzo they had earthen platforms. They had the majority of the colossal stone heads were discovered here, and it was thought for a long time that San Lorenzo was more of a ritual center and that nobody lived there. But that's changing now. We believe that this was a settled community with some early evidence of chiefly societies in Mesoamerica. Here you can see a photo, probably from the 1950s, of the excavation of one of these colossal heads. This photo shows several things that I think are interesting. For one, look at the expression of the colossal head itself. This is a different person. This is a clearly different facial expression than the other colossal head I've showed you. You can also see clearly indicated, really accentuated, that helmet that this character is wearing. Also note the large group of people gathered around to help excavate this thing. They're heavy, they're really hard to get up out of the ground if they've been buried. Also, this shows that archaeology isn't just the work of a few educated Westerners coming down from the United States or coming from Europe to dig in Central America. We work with local communities, and it's often the local guides who show us where this stuff is to begin with. Now, after the sort of apex in political complexity at San Lorenzo, another Olmec center developed during the Middle Formative at the site of La Venta. Here you can see some excavations, again in the mid-20th century, in the main earthen pyramid at La Venta. Now, La Venta is interesting in part because it appears to have been carefully laid out. This is going to be important. Pay attention to how this compares with later Mesoamerican sites. At the site of La Venta, there was a large earthen pyramid that some people think was actually built to mimic the shape of a volcano, and then a long series of other platforms and other smaller pyramids and even some standing stone stelae that are all carefully laid out and carefully kind of oriented, suggesting planning, suggesting someone is in charge of organizing this. Some interesting things that were found at La Venta include this pavement that's been called the Jaguar Mask, or it may depict the Ceiba Tree of Life celebrated by the later Maya. But what's significant about it for our case here is that this ritually significant mosaic pavement was actually buried on purpose down in the ground. They dug a hole, the ancient Olmecs, they laid out this pavement, and then they actually covered it up, which suggests its presence was important even more than being visible. Similarly, this famous cache of green stone figurines, which may actually represent a group of people standing near the carved stone stela at the site, was originally dug down into a pit and buried, and then stratigraphically the excavators were able to identify that over time ancient Olmec people actually returned to the spot, dug it back up, and then we don't know what. Did they just look at it? Did they reorganize it? We're not sure. And then reburied it. Now that suggests either that it was marked at the surface and or that they knew exactly where it was and that its location was significant somehow. And perhaps the act of reorganizing it, centering the jadeite statues around a central figure that you may be able to see there that's actually carved out of softer sandstone, maybe that was part of the purpose of it. But clearly memory and getting affiliated with the landscape were part of this activity. Also at La Venta, we see clear evidence for social hierarchy. That's perhaps best demonstrated by a tomb that was discovered full of jadeite offerings and other wealthy, items of wealth. But the two people buried in it were actually juveniles, about 13, 14 years old, which suggests they probably didn't have time to achieve that status in their own lifetime. Rather, they were born into a noble family. Some of the carved stone stelae that we can find in the Olmec region, they're mysterious. We're not sure quite what they mean, but they do seem to indicate a particular kind of religious belief associated with the rulership. So you can see here on this carved stone, the real stone is on the left and a drawing of it is on the right. You can see two people who are normal humans but wearing really outrageous costumes. One appears to be wearing a fish hat. The other one is wearing some other kind of really elaborate hat. They're wearing capes. They're wearing, special skirts. They've got staves of power they're holding. Clearly, they're important people. In ancient Mesoamerica, nobles kind of wore their wealth. But they appear to just be humans, and they're talking to one another. But look above their head, and for lack of a better term, it appears as though they're surrounded by ghosts. Some kind of spirits seem to be floating around. We believe, perhaps from later Mesoamerican examples, these might be ancestors. So in a sense, this is a conversation not just between two rulers, but between two ruling dynasties that incorporates the living rulers and their deceased ancestors. Other evidence of rulership from the Olmec region maybe gives us an idea about what rulers were supposed to do. This throne upon which rulers probably sat also itself depicts what appears to be a ruler in a particular position of power or an important position. For Mesoamericans, caves are considered mouths to the underworld. The earth itself is alive. This is an animistic society. The earth is alive. Forces of nature, even mountains and so forth are alive. And caves are like a mouth of the world monster, in a sense. And so with that in mind, you can see perhaps that this seated noble, who appears to be at the mouth of a cave, that itself has a snout. Look above his head, and you can see nostrils and fangs. So this is a living mouth. It's almost sort of like a jaguar's mouth that this ruler is sitting in. This has been interpreted to suggest that rulers were important because they sort of sat at an important crossroads between the worlds of the living and the worlds of the dead. And in that sense, they serve to be sort of a means of communication across that realm of existence. Now, I realize there's a lot of interpretation and inference going on there, but I have some other evidence to back up what I'm saying. In terms of the importance of jaguars, the Olmecs appear to have believed in a type of transitional or transformational creature similar to a werewolf. We call them were-jaguars. And we can actually see in things like masks and things like other often jadeite carvings, characters that combine the features of animal and human bodies. Now, we actually know from talking to modern living Mesoamerican native peoples that in this worldview, in the Mesoamerican worldview, there isn't such a strict division between humanity and the natural world as we tend to see in Western society. So it appears as though the Olmecs believed at least certain powerful ritual practitioners, who we might call shamans, had the ability to transform into a jaguar. In some cases, when the Spanish arrived, this was actually written down in court documents that people believed they could transform. You can see in some Olmec artifacts that this was considered sort of a process. You can see the mask on the left appears to be, in many ways, largely human, except for the upturned snout and the downturned sort of snarling jaguar mouth, as opposed to the character on the right, which appears to be mostly jaguar, with the minor detail that it's wearing human clothing, jewelry, and a helmet, essentially. So you can see that this is depicting sort of different phases of transformation for these ritual practitioners. How might the Olmecs have believed that they could transform into jaguars? Well, one suggestion has been the use of hallucinogenic substances. Bufo marinus, for example, is a kind of toad that appears to secrete a chemical toxin that may be used as a hallucinogen. Please don't go out and test that yourself. But Bufo marinus bones have been discovered in some Olmec tombs. Also, similar to the shark tooth I showed you from my own research, Olmec bloodletters suggest the early practice of what we know is a later popular practice in Mesoamerica, especially by the nobles, which is the letting of their own blood to use as a sacrificial offering. There's some other things about the Olmecs that are just mysterious. We don't know really what they mean. One of those has to do with these hollow baby figurines. I personally find them kind of creepy. Clearly they're made by master artisans, but these actually appear not only in the Olmec region but elsewhere in Mesoamerica, suggesting that the Olmecs influenced other parts of Mesoamerica. And considering that there's an early Olmec site called El Manatee where they appear to have actually sacrificed real children, somehow children and the sacrifice of children may have been involved in Olmec religious belief. Now, without going into too much detail about it, just for the sake of time, it's also very fascinating how the Mesoamericans calculated time. They had two types of calendars, one much like ours, a 365-day solar calendar based on the movement of the sun across the sky, divided up into 18 months of 20 days with a short 5-day period of ritual danger, and they didn't actually need a leap year in their way of calculating this, so in some senses it's perhaps even more accurate than ours. But they also had a 260-day ritual calendar, which perhaps was based on the gestation of the human baby. So I find that really fascinating. On the one hand, they've got this macroscalar concept of time and the universe and the movement of the stars and so forth, and then on the other hand, they're looking inward at their own human bodies and calculating time according to how long it takes a baby to be born. Now, these two calendars were actually used in conjunction with one another. Their days were given numbers and particular names, and so every 52 years, the specific days of these calendars would meet back up, and they would have a special ceremony, the New Fire ceremony, to celebrate that 52-year calendar round. But they also thought of time in bigger scales as cyclical, as repeating. And that's exactly why the world didn't end in 2012. The Maya calendar didn't end in 2012. It really never ends. The Maya calendar just keeps repeating. I almost think of like cogs in an old-fashioned watch. They just keep rolling. Now, the Mesoamericans were also able to calculate huge numbers and amounts of time and predict things that will still not happen for thousands of years. And they were able to do that in part because they had the concept of zero. In fact, the Mesoamericans had the concept of zero centuries before the Europeans did. Here you can see some drawings of the Maya month and day glyphs. So months and days were given particular names, and then they were also numbered. And in a Mesoamerican tradition, you would be named according to the day you were born. We're not exactly sure when Mesoamerican writing began. There are different contenders for the earliest Mesoamerican writing. One contender you can see on the left there is actually an Olmec example of the Cascajal block. It appears to have repeating patterns of symbols, and it's hard to date it. It was found by a road crew, and it was not found with a datable sample, so we're not exactly sure how old it is, but it does appear to be Olmec. And then most writing in Mesoamerica was in vertical columns, so the fact that this appears to be in horizontal columns is also unusual. But there were different kinds of writing in Mesoamerica. You can see Maya hieroglyphs over on the right. In fact, one documentary that you could watch for this film is called Cracking the Maya Code. It's a really one documentary you could watch for extra credit in this class is called Cracking the Maya Code. It's a really neat video about how Mesoamerican writing works, how Mayan hieroglyphics work. Other kinds of writing in Mesoamerica are more pictographic. You can see here some drawings in the Mixtec codices. These are books made out of bark paper or deer hide, where they would paint them over with plaster and then basically draw these stories on them, but the stories are also codified symbols, and so in some senses they're very similar to writing. You actually follow from the lower right to the upper left there and kind of use those red bars to kind of guide your eye, and what it tells is the story of a particular Mixtec sort of hero king, Lord Eight Deer, as he conquers his way toward his kingdom. Now, the development of the first city in Mesoamerica took place in the Valley of Oaxaca. This is near where I do lab work for my own research. And in the Valley of Oaxaca, you've got everything from early archaic sites showing the development of the early domestication of squashes and so forth, to a massive city that developed late in the formative period. Now, one of the first powerful villages in the Valley of Oaxaca is known as San Jose Mogote. This was a village that developed in the early formative period. By the middle formative period, San Jose Mogote appears to have been involved in some kind of conflict. They were fighting with other communities, There's evidence that I'll show you shortly for some human sacrifice. And then the site appears to be kind of depopulated. And what we think happened is the rulers of San Jose Mogote, this early and middle formative town, basically moved to a nearby mountaintop known as Monte Alban, and they established a city up there in a defensible location that ultimately came to conquer other parts of Oaxaca. So this carving you can see here at San Jose Mogote, this is Monument 3. This is another contender for early writing in Mesoamerica. Between the legs of this character are what have been interpreted as the Zapotec glyphs for one eye or one earthquake. If you recall what I said to you about how people are named, that's probably this person's name. He was born on the day one eye or one earthquake. But he doesn't appear to be having a good day. What's located over his torso is a blood glyph or a heart glyph. And note that his eyes are closed and his mouth is open. This has been interpreted as evidence for human sacrifice. What's probably happened here is a named enemy noble, some kind of leader of another community, has been captured by the leaders of San Jose Mogote and is being sacrificed. Shortly after the carving of this stela, the community at San Jose Mogote moved up to Monte Alban and established that early city. Now, the first Mesoamerican city that they established at Monte Alban was itself occupied for centuries. It's a complex site that's been built and rebuilt over time. But there's a really fascinating history here. It was founded around 500 before the Common Era, occupied throughout the late formative period and into the Classic. And during the Classic, it reached a peak population of up to about 50,000 people. One of the major accomplishments of building Monte Alban wasn't just moving all these people up to the top of a mountain and building a community up there. It was also the fact that they leveled the top of the mountain itself, the largest sort of investment of human labor that you see in this photo of the main plaza at Monte Alban as I'm looking north from the southern platform, is actually that they leveled out the sort of top of this mountain. Now, located near some of the main architectural features at the plaza, at the main plaza, one of the central things, right as you go visit the site today, one of the first things you walk past is a ball court. Again, this really demonstrates the ball game was intimately related to politics and religion in Mesoamerica. Now, Monte Alban, like other powerful early city-states in Oaxaca, had a pattern where the elites were mostly the ones who could live around the civic ceremonial downtown of the city. This is similar to what we've seen in other parts of the ancient world. So in these images, you can see parts of what are left of some of these noble palaces up at Monte Alban, as well as some of the tombs that are actually underneath the floor of those palaces. At a nearby site of Lambityeco, there's actually a tomb that has the faces of what appear to be the two people who were buried there. You can see that in the lower left. And then there's a later tomb, probably from the post-classic period, from the site of Mitla, that you can see in the upper left there. So as Monte Alban was established late in the formative period, as those chiefly rulers of San Jose Mogote moved up top of the mountain to establish this defensible site, they brought with them their artistic style of depicting human sacrifice. At least that's what we think is happening. So a series of large carved stones known as the danzantes, which is the Spanish word for dancers, has been found at the southern end of the main plaza at Monte Alban. But now archaeologists don't think that these are dancers. They think instead that these are probably sacrificial victims, and perhaps in a few cases they are people practicing auto-sacrifice. But what they appear to show is the importance of sacrifice and conquest in the establishment of the first Mesoamerican city-state. And that's a pattern we're going to see later for the powerful central Mexican site of Teotihuacan in the next lecture, that ritual sacrifice and the display of sacrifice in big public events that the commoners could witness what the elites were up to, that is involved in the establishment of and justification of hierarchical power in Mesoamerica. Another kind of carved stone feature that's found at Monte Alban that suggests this association with conquest and the establishment of this city-state is the conquest slabs. These are stone slabs that are pressed into the side of a building. It's probable that they're actually basically recycled from somewhere else, that they've been brought from somewhere else and put into the facade of Building J at Monte Alban. But what they show is a hill glyph, which is the Oaxacan way basically of showing a place, and the upside down head of a ruler. I have a drawing that shows it better. So here in this drawing of a Building J conquest slab at Monte Alban, you can see what looks like a specific place depicted on the hill glyph, the hill of the such and such. For example, my first excavation in Oaxaca was at Tututepec, the hill of the bird, Yucutsa. So it's probably a particular place, a hill glyph, with the upside down head that's been interpreted as a deposed ruler, perhaps actually a killed or sacrificed ruler. And then what appear to be dates, series of bars and dots. Dots are 1, bars are 5. So this may actually show a specific year or even day when the rulers of Monte Alban conquered another community, and they're bragging about it here at Monte Alban, and basically a form of political propaganda. So in the next section of this lecture, we will move on and talk about the Mesoamerican Classic and Post-Classic period.